Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. Today, we are joined by Josh Thomasis, a seasoned educator leader and founder and CEO of IP Squared, a leadership consulting firm dedicated to helping socially conscious organizations unlock their full potential. Now, Josh brings decades of experience at the intersection of education, equity, and innovation. You've held senior roles across the field, from executive vice president of the Great Oaks Foundation, where you helped scale high dosage tutoring and national service model, to the dean of innovation at Bank Street College of Education, where you led groundbreaking work on teacher preparation and racial equity through initiatives like Prepare to Teach and the Center for Culture, Race, and Equity. Before that, Josh, you spent a decade with New York City Department of Education, ultimately serving in Chancellor Walcott's cabinet, and you helped launch over 350 small schools, a model validated by 9 MDRC studies showing strong gains in graduation and college outcomes for historically underserved schools. You began your teaching career at the El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice in Brooklyn, and you live in Brooklyn, where you coach baseball and still find time to walk your scruffy dog. Josh, welcome to the show.
Such a pleasure to be here, David.
Let's start out with the important questions. What is the name of your dog, and why is he so scruffy?
Her name is Pumpkin, and that's her name because my 6-year-old and 8-year-old sons decided that was her name, and they agreed.
That's
and
it.
So it was done.
Amazing. So you've had this enormously successful career, all the way back from teaching to working in the chancellor's cabinet to the work that you're doing now. But what I want to do is I really want to focus at your time in New York City Department of Education at the time. Take me back to the early 2000s. What was the problem that you were brought on to solve for? And what was the relationship between that problem and the Children's First Initiative?
So I'll actually start before I came, because it's part of the story that's worth telling. The first time I ever saw Joel Klein was at a protest for the closing of Bushwick High School in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where we were arguing for why was the central office closing our school. And he made one of the most potent arguments I've ever heard, and I've ever heard a white man make in a setting that was almost entirely people of color, saying that we are actually fighting for the rights of your children to a sound basic education, and that it's the civil rights issue of our time. We walked out of that room thinking maybe we were on the wrong side of the story, and maybe Bushwick should close. And 4 years later, in fact, the same community that had protested the closure held a parade for the 4 new schools that had moved the graduation rate at Bushwick High School in 4 years from 23% to 68%. That showed a thought in my mind that maybe I should come to the central department and help. 2 of my key mentors, Michelle Cahill and Eric Nadelstern, had both been brought on by Chancellor Klein. And I thought anybody smart enough to hire the 2 of them might be worth working for. When I arrived in the summer of 2004. We were in the midst of trying to shift from aspirations around a school system to what Chancellor Klein regularly called a system of great schools, where the unit of change was the school. And the core hypothesis was that from a perspective of parents, of children, and of teachers, the 3 most important pieces of any school, the thing that mattered was the school. It didn't matter who was in the district. It didn't matter what person was sitting at Tweed. What mattered was, were we setting up students, teachers, and families to have successful experiences in their school? And that's what they cared about. And that needed to be what we cared about. And so within that, there were some things that we were attempting to disrupt. That the system had the haves and the have-nots. There were the schools who could call and get a favor done in terms of what kids would stay in their schools and what kids weren't. There were schools that could call and say, can you do me a favor and buy this for me? And the way the funding formula was set up was poor schools were essentially augmenting the salaries of rich schools because we were getting allocated on a per teacher basis rather than on a total dollars basis. That there was no meaningful accountability for anybody outside of schools. If you got the job, you got to tell everybody what to do. And everybody better listen to you or their careers might be on the line. There wasn't a logic model for what learning would look like at a system-wide level. There were fantastic schools that had figured this out, some fantastic superintendents who had done really dramatic change work, Tony Alvarado, District 2, Irma Zardoya in the Bronx. There were extraordinary people who'd done it, but they were the exceptions that suggested that there were challenges with the rule itself. And that as a rule, we hadn't moved the graduation rate since we started counting in the mid-'80s.
So let me just summarize where we're at so far, right? You're coming in at 2004. You're coming in after protesting and changing your mind about a school, and graduation rate was a 23% graduation rate in Bushwick. And
Yeah.
you're diagnosing some key areas. Schools have different amounts of liberty and accountability with regards to students that they accept. Some students can stay in the school, some students can be moved out. It's a favor-based economy rather than a fairness-based economy. This funding
Correct.
formula is based on teachers. The people outside of the school have no accountability for the outcomes within the school, and there's no system-wide learning models. Each superintendent or principal can discover their own approach to excellent education or not. How did I do in terms of kind of getting that current state?
Yep, you got it. I think the last thing is there was no design tension in the system so that if a principal or a teacher thought that something was going well, the only option that they had was to go to the United Federation of Teachers or the CSA. And that we hadn't structured the system so that anybody who sat outside of schools thought that their job was to serve folks in schools. So to just give one like really concrete new schools example, a basic problem in the system was paying teachers on time.
Mhm.
It would take brand new teachers up to 6 months to get their first paycheck, which is crazy because you have to pay rent. And we're talking about teachers. And it wasn't until the system and HR, under Joe Klein did a massive set of work and deserves credit for it, understood their job was to, if a school hired a new teacher, to get that teacher on salary before the first day of school so that that teacher could pay their rent and be settled in their pay and their health services so that they could go ahead and focus on their job. That's understanding that the system's job is to serve teachers and schools, not the other way around.
Mm. So, Josh, walk us through. You diagnose the situation. In one word, it's that the system served itself, not students, not teachers, in terms of what they were solving for. So then let's actually, before we get to the solution, what was holding some of these factors in place? I understand that the graduation rate had not ticked up for 20 years, right? And as you mentioned, what were some reasons why the system was what it was for so long?
I mean, one was instability. The chancellor normally only stuck around for 18 to 24 months because of the lack of mayoral control. And so everybody in the system thought we could just hold our breath and wait if we don't like what's happening.
The educational deep
And
state,
so,
is that it?
you joke, it's more just learned cynicism that brilliant people can come into the role. But if they're going to be gone in 18 months to 2 years, then why am I going to shift all of my work and energy?
Yeah,
Even if I agree with everything they're going to do.
right.
The basic logic was sort of a trickle down theory of ed change, which is the people higher up should have all the information, the control of the money, and the control of decision making. And they'll tell the people what to do, who'll tell the people what to do, who'll tell the principals what to do, who'll tell the teachers what to do, who will tell the kids what to do. And I think it's very attractive. I spent a huge amount of time in my decade at Central helping people when they first get a sense of the power of that role and being like, oh, we can sit here and write a memo to 1,800 schools. We should get to tell them, reorienting people. I don't think it was for lack of thoughtfulness or lack of good intent, I think people got jobs in the roles and they thought the best thing I could do is figure out how to tell people how to do their jobs better and that there'd be mistakes. Schools wouldn't spend grant money correctly. People wouldn't provide special education services. Like schools make a ton of mistakes, and all of those mistakes justified creating a massive bureaucratic state that ended up on paper covering everybody's tail on every issue that would come up, but in practice being almost impossible to implement, let alone to implement well for, again, for the three people that matter most, the children, the teacher, and the families. And then part of what was holding it in place was all this good intent that stifled not just innovation, but stifled responsiveness to the people in front of us to actually meet their needs. And that we needed to shift all of our focus towards that. That was the aspiration. We'll talk in a little bit about where we went well and where we had places to go.
All right, well, let's get to that solution space. We've identified the problem with the current state. We have schools doing different things with different accountability systems that are based on relationships rather than fairness and policy. We have the things keeping it in place is chancellor instability, top-down focus. And then here comes some folks like you who have some solutions to these problem sets. So what solutions did you guys develop against these problem sets? How did you develop those solutions? And what were some of the effects of how you got after those problem sets?
Well, one shift, David, I want to make in your question is I don't think it's fair to say that there was an accountability system in the sense of if I was sitting at Central, I had a responsibility to my bosses. If I was sitting as a principal, I had a responsibility to my superintendent. But there was no meaningful conversation about a responsibility for student outcomes. And that I had a responsibility to make sure that the kids that I was working with or the schools that I was working with and their kids were actually thriving. And so I think that's one thing to note. I think there are a bunch of ones. I'll sort of circle around the sort of big innovation inside of managing of schools. But I think the important ones are the creation of fair student funding so that dollars follow the students and they're actually dollars. I think a huge one is the kinds of work around quality HR and service delivery, shifting the thinking of Central into a service mentality, making sure everything from the buses run on time to school food to quality facilities repair and HR. I think setting up an accountability system as imperfect as it was, and we'll talk about those imperfections, but actually shifting the conversation so that those of us who are in schools began to understand and grapple with what we were doing. I was in a Puente for a decade. We really struggled. Were we doing well? Were we not doing well? We thought we had a very challenging population. We didn't even know if we could tell a good story about that, but we didn't know. And the thing I want to say about that is, teachers work harder than you do no matter what you do. There's nothing harder in this work than the work of teaching. And teaching is fulfilling and heartbreaking work at the same time. And I hold in my heart the faces and names of the students who I succeeded with and the ones I failed. And it hurts to fail. I haven't taught in 20 years now, and it still hurts. I'm calling them up as we're speaking, and, if I don't hold it together, my voice could crack. And there are lots of reasons why I failed those students, most of them not having to do with me. Most of them being about what happened. I was a high school social studies teacher, but well before they got into my 9th grade history class. But there's a role I played and figuring out how to hold both truths. We're not so good at that in this moment in the world, but hold two truths that I did everything I knew how to do, and I deserve great credit and accolades for that, and that it wasn't enough for a particular group of students. And there were things that I didn't know that had I known them, I would have done a better job. And then we have to figure out, and we didn't figure it out perfectly by any stretch, how to do both of those things. Because when a Puente Academy understood that actually it was serving one of the hardest groups of students in the city for a non-transfer school, and therefore we understood what we were up against, we could actually figure out who we should be comparing ourselves to in terms of high school and where we should be, our growth of learning was from. And that was really important for our development, not having that anchor means that everybody's spinning a story about why they did the best they could, even if graduation rates don't move for 20 years. And that's the thing you got to change on accountability. The new schools work obviously was a disruptive innovation, closing large failing schools, predominantly high schools, but also elementary, middle schools, and giving a new group of educators a shot at changing the basic functions and trying to drive innovation that way. And then the thing that drove a shift in school management was the system responding to the innovation in a way that promoted stability, because systems are perfectly designed for exactly what they're doing. And two things happened as I arrived at Tweed that I watched that resulted in the creation of the autonomy zone. And those two things were there are 4 new schools going into the Jefferson campus, and all 4 principals got fired sight unseen by the then superintendent in charge of the Jefferson campus. And there were 4 new schools going into the Wingate campus. These are both campuses in Brooklyn, central Brooklyn. And the superintendent in that campus went in and explained to the schools that they had to throw out all of their plans for innovation, that the school district had a very concrete set of rules that every high school in the district had to follow exactly to the letter, and that if they were going to be a principal in this district, they had to follow them, even though there was only one school in all of that district that had a graduation rate higher than 50%. And yet they were going to insist that we all have to do it exactly the same, even though not even half of our kids are succeeding. And so the result of that was the creation of the autonomy zone. Every new school that was open that year was automatically in, and every what was then called a region was invited to nominate 2 schools to attend. All of those schools agreed to exchange increased authority. That is, they got to be in charge of many more things for increased accountability. They were going to pilot the first report cards. There were going to be public conversations about their performance.
Let's take some of these in a little bit more depth, because I think you threw out some really important ideas. You talked about fair student funding. You talked about HR, accountability systems, as you talked about with the report cards. You talked about comparison groups that allowed educators to understand where they sat in the total kind of population, closing large schools, giving new schools opportunity. So let's spend 5 minutes and let's start out with the fair student funding as an approach, an operational approach that drove different outcomes for schools. And we talked a little bit before, you'd mentioned schools used to be funded by teachers and then shifted that model to students. I hear this a lot right now in kind of the educational talk. Funding should follow the students. It's a little bit more complex now in terms of the way that states are thinking about it. But how did fair student funding help schools innovate and reduce inequities in New York City public schools vis-a-vis graduation rates and outcomes?
I haven't seen the research on it, so I'll tell you the anecdotes. I was in charge of the budget of El Puente at the moment of transition. And so one year I was told I had 22 and a half teacher positions or something. I don't remember the exact number. It was a long time ago now. And the next year I was told I had several $1 million. So the problem with the teacher positions is that a school like PS 321 in Park Slope that can hire 30-year veterans, their average teacher salary in today's dollars, we won't try and go back to 1995, but in today's dollars, their average teacher salary will be well into the hundreds of thousands, right? 115, 120,000. Most of their teachers are 20, 25-year veterans, and those teachers deserve those salaries. But if it's just a one-for-one, let's just assume the PS 321 has 22 teachers at 100,000+ a teacher. Let's do it 100 just to round off. That's $2.2 million. And let's assume El Puente is only attracting brand new teachers, so they're paying $75,000. That basically means that El Puente is paying for the additional cost of PS 321's teachers. So you're incentivizing those schools. When it becomes full salary, when I just get the cash, then the wealthiest schools in the cities that have the most veteran teachers, have to actually say, I want more teachers, but I can't afford teachers at the most expensive rate. So I need to have some of my teachers be newer teachers, which is great for everybody. It gets new teachers into great schools where there are a lot of available mentor teachers, and it gets fewer positions for expert teachers in those schools so that they might go elsewhere.
Hmm.
Um, that's one key piece. The second is, of course, the weighting of need. I think it was Seattle that did this first. They weighted it much higher than we were able to do in terms of available funds, but that you anchor the additional money for all sorts of things, from homelessness to special education and multilingual learners, so that you try to incentivize a school to say, we want more of these students instead of, can we get these students out, because my budget doesn't change if I have 15 students who need an ICT class or 20. So I would rather have 12. Let me figure out how to get the toughest kids out of my school. Instead, you want to incentivize the opposite. I want to run 2 full ICT classes. It will let me hire more teachers. It'll be stronger for my program. So I want these students in my school. That's the behavior you're trying to get. I don't think we got the numbers strong enough to fully get that behavior, but we got it a lot better than it was. Before, there was absolutely no financial incentive to keep students who were more challenging than a perceived norm. And now there are significant incentives. I work with a bunch of schools, and on a regular basis, I hear schools saying, let's open another class for whatever, 12 to 1 to 1, because it will work better. We'll be able to hold on to all of these teachers, and we'll have some extra money to do this work. And that is sort of music to my policy ears.
This is very, very important. And I want to talk about how you thought about creating comparison groups for students. But I want us to be clear when you talk about this policy and how to create incentives to solve problems on behalf of public education. The notion that people will do the easiest thing is not like a moral right or wrong. It's just is what it is. And so what I hear you saying is create incentives for people to do hard things, and people will be more likely to do them. And really look at how these positions are funded vis-a-vis how teachers versus cash drive certain behaviors, right? And then who benefits from those behaviors as a system. The question I think continually is, how is the system benefiting if we're defining the system benefiting as student outcomes across groups and across different groups of students? All right, so we talked about fair student funding. Let's hop over to comparison groups. Story that you gave here was, we thought we were doing good work. It was hard for us to understand how hard or easy the work was going in El Puente, but then you had an opportunity to really get a sense of comparison groups. Tell me a little bit more about that innovation and how that shifted your thinking around problem solving in public education.
I just need to say before we go further that I did not run the fair student funding work. I did not run the comparison group. I benefited and watched brilliant colleagues work on this work more than I can shout out a name. So I'm helping you sort of grapple with and explain, but I don't want to take credit like this is my work specifically.
Much appreciated. You are representing the work today on our show, Josh.
You know, the comparison group question goes back to like what I was struggling with the children I failed, which is, I'll tell another quick story. We were a performance-based assessment school. The hardest day of my career was I went to another school that also did performance-based assessment. I was teaching junior year American history, the research paper. And I read their research papers. And I literally went home and cried. I did not cry my first day of teaching. This was the day I cried. And I cried because what my students were doing was nothing like what I saw. And I thought, I am a terrible teacher. What am I doing? And by luck, there was a professor from Hunter College, Pedro Pedraza was his name, who was studying our school. And he saw me the next day and he said, how'd it go? And I said, it went terribly. And he said, why? And I said, well, this is what happened. And I think I'm doing a terrible job. Maybe I don't even belong as a teacher. And his son happened to go to that school. And then he explained to me that in order to get into that school, it was a transfer school, but it was a transfer school for kids who didn't do well at places like Stuyvesant and Tech. You had to pass what were then the CUNY tests out of remediation. They don't exist anymore. And that's what you had to do to get into the school. And I thought, oh, wait, my kids are working to pass those at the end of senior year, not at the entry to freshman year.
Right.
It's really useful to see what quality writing looks like. I can hold that bar, and I became totally gratefully experienced because I could say to my students, this is what it looks like to write a successful paper as a high school student. And to have that, but also to understand that my road as their teacher and their road as students were coming from a different place than passing the CUNY entrance exam in ninth grade, which none of them were able to do, would have been able to do. And so the comparison groups tried to understand all of the factors, middle school test scores, poverty, language, to help us understand the relative challenge of the students we were facing. And it was to try to frame not the feeling, but to understand the floor and to help us frame the supports that were necessary and help us ask questions about concentration of challenge and the like as a system. In general, for example, it looked like if you had challenging students at roughly 40% of your student body, those students performed extraordinary. But if it was 80% of your student body, those schools had a much, much harder time moving. And began to go, that's a system question, not a what's wrong with this group of teachers or this principal, because it just requires extraordinary work to move if 80 to 90% of your kids have level of challenge. So that's what the comparison group work was trying to understand.
This is so important, Josh, and I really appreciate you raising it. It takes me back to Al Franken and Betsy DeVos and talking about growth added scores versus performance in terms of educational outcomes. It takes me back to Daisha Toll and Achievement First and her dedication to ensuring that we don't fail students by lowering our expectations. This is worth a little bit of extra time because I think the question of what quality schools are and how to measure schools is one of the foundational questions in education in 2000 and in 2025, right? So I want to stay with this. How do we both understand challenge and move students to the places that they need to go in a system like New York City, but also in education writ large? And let me ask another way. How do we hold ourselves accountable for growth while contextualizing the challenges that our students face and that our schools who serve those students face in our public education system?
I mean, it's a great question. I will tell you that it's holding those two truths at the same time, right?
Yeah.
The reality of El Puente of the 2000s, right? I left there in 2004, July of 2004 is when I started at Tweed. But the folks who came after me and who I'd partnered with during is mostly El Puente got A's on the report cards when they were giving letter grades. But El Puente was not satisfied with its A. Why? Because it was getting an A relative to its level of challenge, because the report cards worked much better because there were many more diverse measures for high schools than for elementary and middle schools. But El Puente also knew what its graduation rate was, and it was in the 80s, but it wasn't in the high 90s. And it also knew that it had a significant college readiness and college persistence challenge because it had closed one gap, but the next, and so I never knew my colleagues to rest on their laurels on their A grade. Their A grade acknowledged that for the students they were getting, they were really moving them significantly and should be celebrated for it. So I think at our best, that's what it looks like. Happy to talk about. I think there are some challenges in how to do that well. And there were certainly lots of examples where I don't think the report card grade accurately captured what the school was doing well. I think the report card's one of the big challenges to just name, particularly at this moment in American history, is they undervalued social studies and science, which at this moment I would say is teaching about the real world, teaching about values, and teaching about American democracy. All of which, if there's any lesson of the last 10 years, it's that it would behoove us to value the teaching of science and the teaching of the basic fundamentals of how to participate in American democracy, and to make sure we're valuing that in what we measure. I think what we did well was to use the metrics that were available to at least start measuring and start having this conversation with all of the imperfections in it, but we didn't deal with some of the perverse outcomes like people undervaluing social studies and science. And I think in the next iteration of that, I would want, if I could wave a magic wand, I would want to tackle that in the next iteration.
I want to name this one more time here because there are a lot of folks, Josh, in states, in towns and districts across the country who have decided that their approach to educational reform is to concentrate opportunity through things like screens, through things like testing, through things like cleaving off towns from each other do things like giving students special education vouchers to leave their districts so that their numbers look good. And I just want to really contrast that with how you guys thought about fair student funding and incentivizing schools and districts to solve problems, how you looked at comparison groups to help elevate the grades by saying, yes, growth matters. If a student is coming in on a second grade reading level and is leaving on a 12th grade or even 11th grade or 10th grade, maybe we wouldn't get him college career ready, but like that was real effort that it took to accomplish that. So across the country, I just want to name that there are a lot of folks who are not solving those problems. They are creating ways to funnel students into different paths so that different schools have different problems to solve, and then throwing accountability on those schools and those districts and not holding other schools to the same level of scrutiny.
I think there's a fundamental question that goes back to the very creation of the American school system without doing too much of a history lesson. But the fundamental question is, are we going to take responsibility for every child in our community?
Mhm.
And I don't claim that we did that perfectly by any stretch, but fundamentally, we did think that was our task. Or are you going to say there are some kids that you just can't teach, which is a very slippery slope? And we see that in District 75, which are for students with significant special needs. We see that obviously for students who are overage and undercredited. We see that for students who don't fit the norm. And I think one of the tasks of a school system is to say to a community,
Mhm.
we are responsible and we will take responsibility for every child in our midst. And that means some tough conversations. It's going to feel like there aren't enough resources and there's certainly not going to be enough know-how. And we're certainly going to make mistakes and we're not going to be perfect. But, we wouldn't want our firefighters to say, oh, there's only some places we're fighting fires. Like, this is our job. And I think as leaders in education, we need to take that stand and take it fully because anything else creates an off ramp for excusing failure. And again, I go back to my own kids and the own kids that I failed in my class, how I forgive myself for what I didn't know. For example, about how to teach. I was never taught how to teach kids how to read. So I didn't know what to do with kids who arrived in high school not knowing how to read. And I did not help them learn how to read.
Mhm.
And I can forgive what I didn't know at that time. But if I turn around and teach next year, I better learn how to teach kids how to read because my failure in the past can't be an excuse for my failure in the future.
Yeah.
And so I can forgive myself so that I can get up and continue to teach another day, but also take responsibility for being better at my job today than I was yesterday. And that's, I think, our work in education at all levels of the system for all of us in each of our roles, supporting schools, being principals, being district leaders, and being teachers.
And not to kind of double down on this callback to history, but one of the great innovations of the American education system is this notion that there is a collective responsibility for educating our youth in order to participate in society. Right. And it's not to say that we've always achieved that. It's not to say that there were not missteps in attacking that idea or elevating that idea, but it is an American idea that in order to participate in society, there is a level of education everyone is required to have, which was uniquely American at the time. I mean, the Prussian system was focused on military service and their universal education, and the American system was really focused on self-governance and this notion of a common good.
Absolutely. And I think our task has been, like in so much of America, expanding our understanding of that common good
That's right.
around the places where that definition looks very different around issues of class and issues of race and issues of gender than 100 years ago in terms of women access to being lawyers and doctors and business leaders, which certainly was not part of the education system of the 1920s, certainly not for African American or Latino or immigrant communities, and certainly not for poor students. And part of the work that I've been involved in around career and technical education and dual enrollment work has been around fighting for access to high quality opportunities for every child.
Mhm.
And that's a hard, good goal.
Yeah. We talk about solving for the right problems, not because we have the best solutions all the time, but holding the right problem in front of us drives the kind of innovation that helps improve outcomes. So let's just get back to our early 2000s. You are part of an amazing group of people who are like, I want to solve for improving outcomes in New York City public schools. There are things like fair funding, breaking down high schools, autonomy zones. What were some of the outcomes that you guys were able to generate? And what can we learn from the approach of education reform in 2025?
The most notable outcome is that when you look at 2000 and you look at the high schools, 90% of the high schools in the city graduated less than half their kids. And by 20 years later, 80% of the schools graduate 80% of their kids. And no schools exist that graduate less than half their kids. So at the high school reform level, you have a dramatic transformation. In 2000, a third of Black and Latino boys graduated high school. 1/3. 15 years later, it's double that. It's 70%, right? We're talking massive changes in the lives of human beings. And those 9 studies you articulated substantiate that they're from MDRC, massive impact on the small schools work.
Yeah.
I think the causality on everything out of the small schools, because the small schools work and those MDRC studies are essentially function as randomized controlled trials because of who did and didn't get in. I don't think there's a similar comparison of quality research for other pieces of the work. I would tell you that amidst what was otherwise a rocky transition, even Mayor de Blasio acknowledged that there are 2013 test scores, which were the Mayor Bloomberg's last. We had essentially closed the gap with the state and gave us credit for that. There are lots of pieces of evidence. I personally think that the strength and power of the sport organizations like yours, like Outward Bound, like International New Vision, and their role in driving innovation is a success. When I speak to the special education advocates, they still talk to me about the plan that we just finished in the last 2 years and how it's still the right plan. So those are both evidence of success and evidence of work to do. If I had to do all over again, I wish we'd built that special education plan a dozen years earlier and had actually been implementing against it. So that's what I'd say about like how we know what was successful. I think in terms of what it means for right now, I would say a couple things.
And we're at a
Lessons
very
learned.
specific time now, right? Like, I just want to name the conversation about education now is not reform, it's tear down on the federal level. And I would say a level of cynicism, a little bit on the state level. So I just want to contextualize where we're at now. I'm sure there's more nuance that we can bring through, but back to you, Josh. What does this success mean for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally true. Certainly what's happening on the federal level and certainly at some state levels. I think the other thing I would say is, I have a benefit of being a Pahara Fellow. I met 23 of the most amazing people doing really extraordinary work all over this country and walked out of that week totally inspired. Like every time I go to national conferences, I meet people who are doing awesome things. I think there is not the level of system energy in most places, but there is a lot of energy. And even in New York State, I've had the privilege of facilitating the Path Forward in New York, focused on integrating science and reading and educator prep. And we've had the commissioner and the chancellor and the chancellors of SUNY and CUNY involved and deeply committed to working on this. Similarly, we've been working on, in the governor's budget, was a set of new work around building a quality pathway around dual enrollment. We have more dual enrollment in this state than almost anywhere, and we don't yet have all of the guidelines. And this was a big, huge step, and the state is leading on that. So it is true that we are not in the ed reform heyday of the late 2000s, early 2010s. We not have raised the top, but I think there is a lot of energy out there trying to tackle this at the levels at which people are and ready for a moment where we're able to have statewide and national conversations. That said, I think there are a couple really important things for the moment that are challenged. And we've talked about some of them. One is that we have to figure out how to follow the data and the science. And the more we can work on transparency and just understanding, making sure a school like mine knows what's going on with our students and has access to those data, and the communities can see that and have conversations is super important. And that's true around the science of learning and what we're learning around the research.
Hmm.
I think we need to figure out how to drive innovation, and particularly sort of bringing it to New York City for a moment. New York City has the opportunity to really be a driver of innovation without experimenting on students. Why? Because we have so many students that we have enough students and families and teachers who will step up and say, I want this for my child, so let's go ahead and try. Or the child saying, I want this. And that's what we saw with the new schools. Is some students said I would want to go to the Harvard School. And some students would say, I don't want to go to the Harvard School. I had two high school age children. One applied and one didn't. Great. That's fine. That's
Mm.
exactly what we want. And so there's an opportunity to drive innovation. And then there's a set of sectors around education, career partners, the organizations like yours that are working, that are driving innovation. And one of the things that we know about diffusion of innovation is you can't control innovation. We've also learned some things like, what we're doing in New York City around New York City Reads, around actually tackling literacy and taking a stand that every child, that we should figure out how to do the work so every child learns to read by third grade is right on. And there are other states that have done much better than this particular neck of the woods in getting all of the pieces pulling in the same direction on that issue, from the curriculum to the accountability to the educator preparation. I think we know a lot about how to do this, and our collective effort is to get on the same page on it. The last two things I would say are, one, really systematizing how we learn from our experiments.
Yeah.
And I mean that at the individual teacher level, at the network level, at the school level, at the system level, and not just saying, hey, David, I was in your school last week and I thought this looked great and this didn't look great. So let's change this and keep this. Like, we need to not drive this by anecdote. We know enough to know that. And then we need to grapple with, and I think this is probably the hardest one. And we need to do this in deep partnership with our teachers and our principals. Schools are political. They always have been. And this is a very challenging moment. And how do we embrace the diversity of voices in our schools? And how do we use schools as one of the few remaining community institutions to have places of dialogue across difference? Because what we need to do to keep America on track is to learn, relearn, learn again, learn more deeply how to have dialogue across difference, and how to hold to core values and have dialogue across difference. And I think that's our work ahead.
I deeply appreciate your insights here, Josh. You talked about data and transparency. You talked about how to maintain and drive innovation. You talked about how you learn from experiments. How do you bring partners into the system? How do we focus on the right problems like reading? And then how do we accept the political nature of schools? And as we close up, I do want to spend maybe just one more minute of this because, as I've said before, there's a reason why Brown versus Board, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which is separate and equal, was focused on schools as the space to overturn that law. Schools are political spaces. They teach young people what their place will be in society and what we expect of them. And we can't hide from that. So as we're thinking about the current state of education reform, what I want to reflect on is a couple of things. One, good policy can drive outcomes. There is a notion that policy wonks are just kind of like sitting up on the hill, not doing anything. But there are incentive structures that can drive outcomes. And if I may, some of the key things that I've always been deeply impressed with when you talk, incentive structures like funding, funding the right kind of behaviors, in this case, taking on the most challenging students to prepare them for participation in society. Accountability metrics that reinforce growth, not just performance, because that means that you have to take on challenging students in order to demonstrate proficient growth. Comparisons that contextualize, but don't let people off the hook. My students may be coming in from higher needs areas, and that contextualizes what I need to do, but doesn't let me off of the hook for driving outcomes. HR systems that work. And that seems really basic, and I really appreciate you telling this story. Getting people paid on time, bringing faith into the system that we are taking care of the people who are taking care of our students. And then this notion of how to make sure that when things are not working, we can bring new ideas into the system. Now, I'm going to say closing down schools and large schools and bringing in new schools in that space, but Another way to say that is giving the system new ways to solve problems rather than doing the things over and over and over and over again that have driven lack of outcomes to this day. Anything else you want to add as we kind of close up our thinking of this time and place in terms of education reform?
Yeah, I mean, ironically, the one thing we didn't talk about is what Urban Assembly does. And I think the other driver, because you can't close down schools to make a great school system. It's a particularly painful change for a particularly egregious problem, 23% graduation rates at Bushwick High School in 2003. But it is not a solution. We don't have a single school graduating less than 50% of our kids in New York City. And so it's not a solution to it may be getting from terrible to good, but it's not a good to great solution. Figuring out how to get schools learning together around a common set of problems and interests and seeding that innovation and driving that, I think that's for the next podcast, if you invite me back. That's the conversation for how we're going to get from where we are to where we need to be.
Josh, you are one of my heroes. I really appreciate the way you articulate the work. I want to say one last time that one thing Josh didn't talk about was that the work of that administration and the people in that administration brought faith back into New York City public schools that they could educate our young people. Folks from across New York City started putting their kids into the system because they believed that the education system would do right by their kids. And that was because of your and your colleagues' blood, sweat, and tears, and a belief in yourself, and that the system could do right by kids. So on behalf of the kids that we serve here in New York City, I do appreciate your continued focus on equity and outcomes. And I appreciate you taking time to be on our show.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here.
Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams, and have a great day.